Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hey everyone, welcome to this brand new first episode of my new series that I'm launching here in 2021 called Profiles of the Christian Right. I reached out to Mark Potok to cover the topic of Doug Wilson for the very first episode. Who is Mark? I'm reading from his website now, he's an internationally renowned expert on the American radical right who for 20 years helped lead the legendary Southern Poverty Law Center in exposing hate groups, right-wing terrorism, and the rapidly increasing infiltration of extremist ideas into the political mainstream. And then after 20 years at the SPLC, he joined the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right as a senior fellow. And I reached out to Mark because I wanted to talk about Doug Wilson, a sort of famous, or I should say infamous, Reconstructionist-style pastor who runs a very large cult-like church and a Bible college and a ministry training center and a publishing house, and he's got all sorts of things. Basically, he's built himself an empire up in Moscow, Idaho. And so I wanted to reach out to Mark because he's an expert on the radical right as well as the Christian right, and he's done a lot of research and writing on Doug Wilson. So I am super excited to finally be bringing you this first episode of this new series. In fact, I've had people message me saying, when's this episode on Doug Wilson going to come out? I was talking about it as far back as December of 2020. So I finally got a chance now to edit it and bring you this first inaugural episode. And what's really cool is I've already got several people already lined up that I'm going to be talking to this year for this series. I've been in discussions with Catherine Stewart, who's the author of The Good News Club, as well as The Power Worshippers. We're going to do a recording sometime in early February, and I'm really excited to be talking to Catherine again. She's been on this show 2 times before. Also, I've been chatting with Peter Montgomery of the Right Wing Watch. We're making this a regular series. We're doing at least 1 episode a month on my YouTube channel, so go over there, check that out. Please subscribe to that. I've also got another episode that I just did with Mark Potok the other day, and we talked about the Christian identity movement, which is basically the theology, the philosophy that undergirds a lot of white supremacist militia groups in America. And that's very prescient right now, especially given what happened with the Capitol riots and the various militias. So that is an absolutely fascinating discussion as well with Mark. And I'm going to be talking with Mark again. So again, subscribe to the YouTube channel because there's a lot of really good content that's just going straight up on YouTube. I've got so many episodes in the queue actually recorded already with people I've talked to that I can't get them out fast enough, which is a good problem to have, I guess. So I'm doing a lot of more live videos on YouTube and then just uploading them there so you can watch our chat with Peter Montgomery as well as with Mark Potok. And I will say, just before we get into the chat with Mark, that we recorded this episode back in December of 2020. And again, so much has changed, but nothing's changed as far as Doug Wilson. And so we're going to take a deep dive into what's going on with Doug Wilson, the Reconstructionist pastor out of Moscow, Idaho. So let's get into the chat, this inaugural episode of Profiles of the Christian Right with Mark Potok as we take a very close look at Doug Wilson. Happy to welcome Mark Potok to Mindshift Podcast. We've been talking a little bit. I've been researching your work. You are a former senior fellow, is that correct, at the Southern Poverty Law Center and an expert on the religious right. So I'm really interested to talk to you, particularly about Doug Wilson, but I'm sure we'll get into some other topics as we talk about the Christian right. So welcome, Mark.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I should say, I'm no theologian, and to say I'm an expert on the Christian right is more or less true. Really my specialty has been the radical right overall. And of course, there's a lot of theology involved in the radical right in the United States.
That there is. So you worked at the SPLC for how many years were you there then?
For 20 years, I had a variety of jobs. They were essentially all leadership jobs. I was senior fellow there for many years. I was the director of the Intelligence Project. I also created and edited their investigative magazine, The Intelligence Report. Mm-hmm. And I used to do an awful lot of public speaking for the center, both to reporters and journalists, and also in kind of, more lecture settings.
So was it a case of you were researching the radical right and that led you, as you say, into the Christian right? Because there's obviously an overlap. We're seeing that, especially now, aren't we, with the Christian evangelical Trump support, as well as the alt-right, for example?
I mean, yeah, I guess it was, I started out years and years and years ago interested in the kind of skinhead world. But, you start to look at the radical right and you're very quickly into some very strange theologies, quite apart from the more mainstream Christian right. Mm-hmm. So, I had to learn things I had never read about before when I got into Christian identity and British Israelism and Christian Reconstruction and, World Church of the Creator, these very bizarre theological movements.
How is it spilling over into the Christian right, just generally? Because, for example, I talked with Peter Montgomery the other day from the Right Wing Watch, and we discussed the recent Jericho March in Washington, D.C. Now, what you had there was sort of a mainstream evangelical charismatic, but you also had Catholics, you had Messianic Jews, and then all of a sudden you had Alex Jones, as well as a guy from the Oath Keepers, speaking at what was supposedly a faith rally for Trump. So that seems to me like we're seeing this overlap increasingly between the radical right, far right militias, the conspiracy theorists, and Christians and other people of faith.
I think that's true. I think that's a fact. Some of these really radical theologies do grow in part out of fairly mainstream strands in Christianity. So, when we talk about Christian Reconstructionism, in a sense, it's an offshoot of dominionism in general. The idea that, man should have dominion, or Christian men should have dominion over the earth, and so on. And the implication being, as you get into Christian Reconstruction, that Christian ideologues, whatever you want to call them, patriarchs, should run the society in every detail. But, there are many aspects of this. I mean, I spent a lot of time looking at the Christian right through the lens of its attitudes towards homosexuality and kinds of related issues. So, and that I would say there's overlap, obviously. Virtually the entire radical right looks with contempt at LGBTQ people. But one of the aspects of that was how incredibly mainstream some of the Christian right is, despite being really vicious. So, I'm talking about organizations like the Family Research Council, the American Family Associations, which are wealthy. In the case of the AFA, own something like 200 radio stations. When I looked at organizations like American Family Association, Family Research Council, they didn't really have their roots or much overlap in particularly radical theology or these bizarre theologies of the extreme right. But they had, in a sense, you could argue, abandoned any kind of real Christian impulses in order to do their very best to defame in really disgusting ways, in particular, gay men. So, the kind of the central lie of that part of the Christian right was the idea that gay men molest children. Huge rate, vastly higher than straight men. And, that turns out to be utterly false. So in any case, I've had contact with quite different parts of the Christian world at various times and have actually attended and even spoken at a conference or two along those lines.
What got me into it was Christian Reconstructionism. So that's how I came into it. I started studying R.J. Rushdoony and the Dominion theology piece, as you say. Wondered, too, how much of that is his own theology. Of course, he was advocating for death penalty for homosexuals, as well as other biblical categories, I guess you could say, incorrigible teens and women who'd lost their virginity before marriage and so on and so forth. Is that how much of that plays into what you're just describing with the Christian right? How much are they, like, for example, the Family Research Council or the ADF? Because I believe they wrote a book, was it the president of the ADF, The Homosexual Agenda, or something like that? It was exactly that line that you just articulated.
Well, there's a lot of overlap in that sense. Of course, the more mainstream Christian right organizations and thinkers, aren't into the idea of literally imposing Old Testament law on the United States or whatever other country they might be thinking about out there. So, but the defamation and kind of degradation of gay people in particular is obviously a commonality.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, there's common threads. Let's get into this guy, Doug Wilson. I read an article that you wrote in 2004 talking about a big rally that they held in, I believe it was it in Idaho or near, he's from Moscow, Idaho.
Idaho, where the University of Washington is. Yeah. I'm sorry, the University of Idaho.
Yeah, and it was off the back of this book that he had written along with a guy called Stephen Wilkins, and they wrote a book called Southern Slavery as It Was. And this obviously came into a huge firestorm, wasn't it? They were going to have a talk for this book, and it just blew up, didn't it? And your article comes off the back of that. So what can you tell us about Doug Wilson?
Yes. I mean, I had never heard of Doug Wilson, and no one at the Southern Poverty Law Center knew about him really at all until this moment in 2003. Wilson was holding a history conference. As it turns out, he had been doing for a number of years in concert with Steve Wilkins, who's out of Monroe, Louisiana, and runs a kind of Calvinist ministry down there. Mm-hmm. You know, it was quite amazing because the first thing that really made all of this public were a series of anonymously distributed pamphlets that appeared all over the campus of University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho. And what they contained, started out these pamphlets saying these two people, Steve Wilkins and Doug Wilson, are going to be here on such and such a date to talk about their book and their research. And they are the co-authors of a book written a few years earlier called, as you said, Southern Slavery as It Was. And then these pamphlets contained these absolutely amazing excerpts talking about slavery. They said that, and this is just from memory, but, slavery was a relationship based on friendship and mutual affection. And it went on from there to make some just incredible claims. Slaves had it so, the life of slaves was a life of plenty of simple pleasures. They talked about how slaves really didn't have all that much work to do. So they do 2 or 3 or 4 days work in one day on the plantation. And then their friendly bosses would say, oh, sure, fine. Take a few days off, go see your girlfriend at the neighborhood plantation. Now, for me, this was particularly obnoxious because I had spent up to that point quite a few years in part studying the neo-Confederate movement. Mm-hmm. So, and that involved taking on equally ridiculous claims about the Confederacy and the Civil War, the idea that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, and so on. And this fits right into the relationship with, the thought system, the kind of worldview of Wilkins and Doug Wilson, in the sense that they, like Rushdoony before them, who you mentioned earlier, had stumbled on the ideas of a man named Robert Dabney. Robert Dabney was the chaplain to Stonewall Jackson, General Stonewall Jackson in the Civil War, famous Confederate general, of course. And Dabney was a rather unpleasant human being, to be kind. He talked about Black people. His whole thing was justifying slavery as biblical. But not only that, he described Black people as a poisonous taint, as a race essentially of idiots who needed to be guided by white men, or else they would be, living in caves and eating each other and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So Dabney, has been much forgotten by most of us. But was essentially rediscovered by Rousas John Rushdoony, another theologian as well. And Dabney was brought out during the 60s fundamentally as a way of combating or reacting to the civil rights movement. Rushdoony was a bitter opponent of the civil rights movement, bitter enthusiast of the Confederacy and how it had supposedly been screwed by these northern invaders who were coming in for no other reason than to destroy Christianity. This was kind of a basic idea of Dabney's that was adopted by Rushdoony and ultimately by Doug Wilson and Steve Wilkins. that in the North had lost its godliness, had lost its real Christianity, had become a kind of empire of materialistic industrialists who cared nothing for God or godly ways. And so in their mind and their ideology, the South, the Deep South, became a quote unquote the remnant of Christianity, the only real remnant of true Christianity. These were people who were genuinely spiritual, who didn't care for material things, but who were all about, sort of being godly on this earth and so on. So that was the, that idea for the radical right, the extreme right in the 60s played very well. So all of this hoopla about the civil rights movement and African Americans being oppressed was just that hoopla. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the Civil War, only sought to help Black people and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, these are ideas that were revived most importantly by Rousas John Rushdoony. And he wrote a famous book called The Institutes of Biblical Law, which is a play essentially on a book by Martin Luther, and in which he made a case for a society that would be ruled by Old Testament law, and including some of the punishments you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And, some of it was quite amazing, the things you could be put to death for. Astrology, for instance, because, if you read that astrology column in your local newspaper, by golly, you really ought to die for it. And, the dying wasn't going to be pleasant either because, a la the Old Testament, good methods include stoning, dragging behind horses, hanging from trees and that kind of thing. But typically the idea being that it ought to be your neighbors who do it. So that's a little bit of the background. Doug Wilson is another case. Doug Wilson discovers Rushdoony in the 1970s about the time that he takes over a church in Moscow called Christ Church. And at that point, Doug Wilson is becoming more and more and more radical. And at the same time, and this is what I kind of laid out in my big article back then in 2004, what Wilson did was build a kind of religious empire in Moscow. This included a press, Canon Press, which published all 31 of Doug Wilson's really wretched little books. It also included something called the Logos School, which is a leading part of the so-called Christian classical schools idea, the idea that we should teach kids, Greek and Latin, teach according to the ancient Greek model. But mixed in with this, of course, in the case of Doug Wilson, is the idea that, leading heroic thinkers in human history, up there with Plato and Aristotle, if not more important, are people like Robert Dabney, the Stonewall Jackson chaplain we've been discussing, and R.J. Rushdoony. In addition to this, there was more to it. So there were some 200 schools now that had been educated along the Logos School model, Logos School being the lower school that Wilson runs in Moscow. He also created a whole denomination, the Confederation of Reformed Evangelicals, if I remember correctly, CRE. And this essentially acted as a kind of accrediting agency for the various schools as well as churches that Wilson was creating. He created a program to educate young men, particularly in his views, his church views, his theology, and these guys were sent out to plant churches all over the country. So it's really, and ultimately, and perhaps most importantly, in 1994, if I remember correctly, Wilson created St. Andrew's College. Right. The campus of St. Andrew's College is right smack in downtown Moscow now, and is the kind of centerpiece of the whole Wilson empire. What I'm trying to describe, though, is that, although Doug Wilson will deny it, that all of this was part of an attempt by Doug Wilson to essentially take over the town of Moscow, hopefully the nearby town of Pullman, Washington, which is also the seat of the University of, or rather Washington State University. And, all of this was along the idea of a spiritual takeover of these places. Now, we can talk more about this later, but, Wilson has denied wanting to, in a, sort of quote unquote worldly way, take over these places. But in my opinion, he's simply lying. He's an out and out Christian Reconstructionist, although, again, he claims that Christian Reconstruction is dead. But, if you look at his history, which is a long one of interacting with Christian Reconstruction thinkers, and what his actual ideas are, they're basically indistinguishable. In any case, I could go on, but let me...
Yeah, we're getting a good picture. When we return from the break, we're going to get into this issue of tracing the influence of Doug Wilson's ideas, starting with the homeschooling movement that he's very much a part of. His ministry is unbelievably influential in a lot of areas, and I think that's why it's important to speak with experts like Mark Potok, because he has studied the influence of Doug Wilson, Christian Reconstructionism, R.J. Rushdoony, as we've been talking about, and this is what's so critical to understand, is that these ideas, when they get filtered through one or two generations or even three generations now later, people have never heard the names of Doug Wilson, R.J. Rushdoony. They don't know what Christian Reconstructionism is, but yet it's influenced so many areas of life, especially not just in America, but even around the world. So I think this is a very important discussion to have. And as I said before, I'm going to be bringing you more episodes in 2021 as we profile not just individual leaders and influencers in the Christian right, but also we're going to be looking at organizations. And I think these are some of the things I'm going to be talking about with Catherine Stewart, because she's done so much work, so much research and writing on Christian right organizations. That's an important discussion to have too. So look for that as well. One of the things, though, that I wish that Mark Potok and I had gotten into, in fact, when I was tweeting about the fact that I'd had this discussion with him in the middle or end of December, I can't remember when it was a few weeks ago now when we actually talked, someone replied on Twitter to my message and said, hey, wait a minute, what about this issue of federal vision? That's another teaching that Doug Wilson has been associated with over the years, and unfortunately we didn't get into that in this episode, but maybe I can come around again and talk to Mark. We can have a discussion, or someone else who's an expert on this teaching. That's something that we need to unpack in further detail, so that's a future episode, maybe waiting to be done. So we'll see how it goes, but I wanted to mention a couple things really quickly before we get back into the chat with Mark. I wanted to take a minute and say a huge thank you to the newest Patreon supporters of the show. Thank you to Virginia Musselman and Evangelical Carol, and as well Ryan Kerwin Walker. So thank you all for being the latest supporters of Mindshift Podcast. I'm in the process of sending out some really cool gifts from North Wales. So if you support the show at a $5 a month level, I'll send you something that you can only get here. If you support the show at a $10 a month level, I'll give you a free Mindshift Podcast t-shirt. You also get to be part of our closed Facebook group, and it's in there that we do our closed Mindshift Podcast Zoom calls. We just did one a couple of weeks ago with Jared Yates Sexton of the Muckrake Podcast. If you want to take a look at that, I've uploaded that to the Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. So drop in there, like the page, and you can check out our chat with J.Y. Sexton. Also then, this Sunday, as this episode is getting released, the 24th of January, we're going to have Rebecca Drumstead dropping in. She's going to be our guest on our second Mindshift Zoom call, so I'm really looking forward to talking to her. And then in the month of February, we've got Dean Crosets of the People I Meet podcast, as well as Seven, the rapper from Jacksonville, Florida. And both of these guys were on the show not too long ago, so some really fantastic guests coming up. And then we've got Thomas Hanna. He's a therapist, an ex-evangelical pastor out of Tampa Bay, Florida. We've actually recorded an episode that's going to be coming out in a few weeks, and then he's going to be dropping in as our guest in March, and I'll probably have someone else too, because now we're doing 2 of these calls a month, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. I love it, and it may end up being we have them every week. I don't know, but this is just one of the cool benefits that you get for being a Patreon supporter of the show. So thanks to the newest people in the month of January for supporting my work. All right, so let's get on back into this chat with Mark Potok as we continue this inaugural episode looking at profiles of the Christian right, as we continue taking a deep dive into the empire of Doug Wilson. Well, there's a Christian homeschooling emphasis in there as well, isn't there?
That's right. And I really should have mentioned that. That's important because for Rushdoony, the foundational thinker for Doug Wilson, homeschooling was where it's at. So a part of the idea of imposing Old Testament law, on civil society was the idea that quote unquote government schools, public schools, were anathema, that these were instructing children to, defy God and accept all kinds of nasty things and so on. And so that real Christians should pull their kids out of public schools and homeschool them. And in fact, Rushdoony was remarkably successful at that. The United States, as we all know, now has a huge homeschooling movement, vastly larger than any first world country, any industrialized country in the world. And that is essentially thanks to John Rushdoony. That's where it all came from. So Rushdoony is seen as the father of homeschooling. What's less known is what we've just discussed, that, the homeschooling movement that Rushdoony pushed is really about this incredibly, in my view, reactionary view of Christianity and its relationship to the larger society.
I've done a lot of stuff on Rushdoony. In fact, I talked to Dr. Michael McVicker. You might be familiar with his work. He wrote a very good book on R.J. Rushdoony, and he goes into great detail on his founding, like you say, of I wouldn't say founding the Christian homeschooling movement, but like you say, it was hugely influential, going all over the country, arguing in court cases, helping to get Christian homeschooling off the ground, as well as just Christian day schools as well. It wasn't just homeschools, it was kind of like, in his view, homeschooling was the preferred option, but if you couldn't do that, you should at least get your kids out of those government schools and into a Christian school. That was the second best thing. So here's Doug Wilson. He's following in those kind of footsteps, isn't he?
Yeah, and one little aside that maybe is interesting to point out is that these ideas of schools, quote unquote, government schools being evil and indoctrinating our children in terrible ideas, are shared outside of the explicitly Christian world or even religious world, in the sense that, if you look at most militia groups today, most radical right groups, including things like, neo-Nazi groups and Klan groups and so on, they all speak they all speak a rather similar language, the way they talk about schools. The public schools are all about brainwashing children. We got to bring our kids out of them. And, of course, if you're listening to a neo-Nazi group, they'll say, well, that's because the Jews, quote unquote, are destroying the minds of your children. And you might get various, shades of how that's viewed. But this idea of the government, this is what's happened on the American radical right in general. I'm talking way beyond the religious radical right. The idea that the number one enemy, yes, a lot of these groups don't like Black people, don't like brown people, don't like immigrants, don't like gay people, don't like Muslims, and so on. But more and more, when you listen to these groups, the enemy is the government. And so that idea coincides very much with the idea of schools being, indoctrination points to destroy the minds of our children.
Which is so strange to me because most of them are pro-Trump, aren't they? Or they were. What's their stance on the government in relation to being Trump supporters, though? That's what I can't figure out in my mind.
Pure hypocrisy,
how does that work?
Of course, right? If you've got your man in the office, I suppose, then all of a sudden the government is your friend. So let's have the Justice Department go after everybody we don't like, and so on. Look, all of this history that we're talking about is filled with contradictions and hypocrisy. Maybe it's worth remembering that, back in the 1920s, at a time before really massive Catholic immigration had occurred in this country, right, when the United States was still very much dominated by white Protestants, Protestants reacted in part to Catholic immigration with horror because Catholics were starting private schools in the United States. So Protestant, and this was true right across the board, all the major Protestant groups and thinkers saw Catholics as starting these schools in a bid to undermine, Americanism, in a bid to make young Catholic children slaves of the Pope, right? They would take orders from the Pope, and who cared what the President of the United States? And in other words, inculcating them in a kind of secret loyalty, a dual loyalty. So, they were absolutely in favor, all of these Protestant groups and thinkers, of public schools and only public schools, and sought to make illegal the creation of private religious schools. Now it all looks rather amusing looking back.
Yes, it does. And we know there's another element to this story too, the Bible Wars. I remember there's reading about the Cincinnati Bible Wars, and that was all about this thing, isn't it, where Catholic schools wanted to have their own private schools so that they could use their own translation of the Bible, and the Protestants were all up in arms, because they're saying, here's these Catholics coming in, undermining our Bible, our King James, and they wanted the Dewey Reams version, and they were out rioting in the streets, so all this religious stuff, these guys were at each other's throats back in the 19th century. Quite ironic, I think, now, as you say, looking back on it.
Yeah, well, all of these histories surrounding the radical right are just, as I've tried to say, just rich with hypocrisy and irony. Absolutely.
So you said Doug Wilson is a Reconstructionist, and I've read a lot of his work on his own blog. He's quite a prolific blogger, isn't he? He writes all the time, posts maybe a couple times a week on his blog. And he said, he's kind of denied that he's a Reconstructionist, but as you say, look at the profile, as it were, of his ministry, as you could say, his life's work fits that.
Just to interrupt you for 1 second, I remember, when my article came out, it got a lot of attention at the time because it was a more or less comprehensive look, going all the way back to Dabney and looking. Nobody had really written, look at what Wilson is doing in a broad way, essentially taking over this town. At the time that article came out, and it caused a big stir up in the Northwest, a lot of people talking about it. Wilson came out and hotly denied that he was a Reconstructionist to a local reporter up there, and went on to make statements. Of course, I don't remember them verbatim anymore, but essentially saying, that's off way, way, way in the future. We're just talking about regenerating human beings, kind of in the image of Christ, I guess, for the present. And Christian Reconstruction is dead. Well, in fact, Rushdoony and the other Reconstructionists said exactly the same thing, right? That our takeover of society only will follow the quote unquote regeneration of large numbers of people as true Christians, whatever, they think that is. So, even in his denials, he's essentially sounding the same line as before. And we haven't talked about this yet, but, a very, very core set of ideas that are Reconstructionist ideas, but that are core ideas to Wilson. And what many of his books are about the family in society, and in particular, the role of women. And basically, for Wilson, for the other Reconstructionists, family is the most important, the paramount structure, the paramount organization in the society. Government should be almost nothing, right? Government is there to stop us from, the Russians when they invade, and a couple of other things, but, not to provide any kind of succor to its citizens, no safety net, all this kind of thing. So it was essentially an anarchist view of government, an absolute minimization of government.
Yeah, limited government.
And the family ruled everything. So what does that mean in terms of the actual family? It means, for instance, your daughter can't get married until daddy says it's okay. And then it goes on to some other pretty awful practices, which are described in, biblical writings and so on as well, right? I mean, a girl is raped. Well, the rapist, as long as daddy agrees, the rapist can pay the father a bride price and marry the unfortunate girl and cart her off, and she will be his. And then on into the ideas. And, this is not limited to Christian Reconstruction. We see this a lot in kind of headship doctrine and other parts of the Christian church. But, the idea that women should be submissive, that women are only beautiful in their submission to men, and there's that old comparison of the family to the church, right? That, it's headship doctrine. The father's the boss. Yeah. And then it goes on to a whole series of really nasty other things. Now, I need to say that Doug Wilson denies that he is a racist. And let me say, we didn't really mention, but Rushdoony was a straight up racist.
Oh, yeah, he was.
Absolutely opposed to quote unquote race mixing, miscegenation, to give it a fancy name. And Wilson tries to kind of act squirrely about that. He's like, well, Scripture doesn't exactly say no, that you cannot have an interracial marriage. But he then goes on to say in one of his books, but any parent ought to be bloody careful about letting their daughter marry out of her race, because it will bring with it all of these problems and so on. So it gets nasty, and and of course, and he will also, by the same token, say, "Well, I'm not exactly saying what all the Reconstructionists say, which is we will put to death practicing quote unquote gay men." He says, "Well, maybe we need to kill them, but maybe we should just exile them instead." So Wilson has this kind of smarmy way of trying to portray himself as just a wee bit more moderate, if that word can be applied to any Christian Reconstructionist, than some of his Reconstructionist brethren.
Looking at Rushdoony, I've done a ton of work on him. I've written a couple of books. I'm looking for some people to publish my work, but I've done a lot of research on Rushdoony, read his Institutes and a bunch of his other books. And it seems like when you see these second and third generation people like Wilson, Doug Phillips from Vision Forum, he'd be another example, trying to institute Rushdoony's thought. Okay, they distance themselves from the more extreme statements that Rushdoony made, but yet, as you say, in their actual practice, you see the biblical patriarchy, you see that male headship, you see the purity culture, and it does a tremendous amount of damage. I mean, looking at Wilson's empire from the outside, a lot of people have said basically he's running a cult up there in Moscow, Idaho. Would you agree with that it's essentially a cult, kind of an empire?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a cult is a sect we don't like. In a sense. But yeah, I mean, he's an unpleasant fellow teaching really, to say, they're sort of anti-modern doctrines hardly captures it. I mean, they're fundamentalist, vicious. And let me say, to go back to a point you just made a minute or two earlier, that, this is true in the wider Christian world, too, where there was a period in the 70s and 80s where there was quite a lot of mixing of Christian Reconstruction thinkers, including at the time Rushdoony, but other people like George Grant and a number of others, with people from more mainstream evangelical Christian organizations, the evangelical world, and also with a great many Republican politicians, including some very well-known ones. So what happened was, as that became more and more public, and as I say, in the 70s and 80s, people started to write about, what is Christian Reconstruction really all about? And, the shocking thing, probably the single line that did Christian Reconstruction the most damage was the idea that incorrigible children, right, who argue with their mommy and daddy a little too much, should be put to death by stoning. Well, that was a little much for most Americans to take. So what you saw were all of the non-exactly Reconstructionists, the other Christians around them, some of the Republicans and so on, running away as fast as their little legs could carry them. So, people who were Reconstructionists or close to that world started to deny that particular part of it or to minimize it. So, Doug Wilson, for instance, now says, well, maybe not incorrigible children, but if you curse your parents, definitely the death penalty.
It's amazing because I'm sure you've seen this. There was a documentary by Bill Moyers, I think it was in 1987, on Christian Reconstructionism. And I've seen some of the clips on YouTube. You can't watch I've never seen the whole documentary, but there's a clip where he interviews R.J. Rushdoony. And it's even then, Rushdoony is so weaselly, kind of like your Doug Wilson examples, because he kind of confronts him, says, what about this issue of the death penalty for certain things? And Rushdoony's response is, oh, I wouldn't say that. It's God. It's in the Bible.
Right.
It's not, I don't agree with it personally. Well,
it's like Wilson
but the Bible says it.
It's like Doug Wilson talking about slavery. Well, I don't really think slavery is a great thing, but my God, look at the Old Testament, right? God says it's okay. So who am I to say no?
And don't be upset with me. I'm not the one you should be angry with. I'm just parroting what God himself says in the Bible. So you can even see that in Rushdoony.
The big man. Yeah,
exactly.
Let me say, in terms of the smarminess and squirreliness of some of these characters, Doug Wilson in particular, one of the things that he's written a lot about, I said he's written a lot about the family, is that pedophilia, that the molestation of young boys and girls is a capital crime. It should be punished with death. And so he's had very harsh things to say in some of his writings about people who engage, pedophiles, people who engage in that sort of activity. The hypocrisy is that one particular member of his own congregation, of his own St. Andrew's Church and St. Andrew's College and his church was in fact found to have molested several children of other church members. What did Wilson do? report him didn't put him to death, presumably. He'd wind up in the penitentiary. Did he report him to the police? No. Did he tell anyone in his congregation about this man? No. And in fact, as a result of Wilson's not saying anything at all about this, essentially suppressing this information, that man went into the homes of several families who were part of the Christ Church congregation, and may or may not, arguably did molest more children as a result. Ultimately, Wilson presided at the wedding of that man. He got him married off in the hope that somehow this was going to cure his pedophilia. So I'm just saying that, the man's a slippery propagandist. He says absolutely clearly in several places, pedophilia should be punished with death, but not when it's one of his pals.
Exactly. What a double standard. That's the thing. Well, this is the question then, I guess. What's the danger of a guy like Doug Wilson? Okay, he's squirreled away up there in Moscow, Idaho. Most people may not have even heard of this guy. Should we be concerned about what he's doing and what he's trying to do?
There are 200 Logos-inspired schools around the country teaching middle school and high school kids these ideas. So, when you see some lunatic on television saying that Trump won the election, or that, whatever it may be.
Conspiracy theory.
Satan's involved in faking votes for Biden, or whatever it may be, very often those people come out of that world. So, it's a kind of teaching of ignorance, not to mention teaching of a kind of really nasty attitude toward other people that is being disseminated very widely. I mentioned earlier, he has something within his college, New St. Andrews College, which is called, if I remember, the Gray Fellowship or something like that. In any case, what it is it's a program specifically designed to train young pastors who will then go out and plant other churches with these same ideas. So, we don't know how far these ideas have spread, but they seem to have spread rather far. I've covered and knew about, long before I knew anything about Doug Wilson, a neo-Confederate group based here in Alabama, where I am, called the League of the South. The League of the South is very close to these ideas. League of the South sees Robert Dabney and Rushdoony as forebears. They are Christian Reconstructionists themselves. And they have, they are openly white supremacist, right? The League of the South talks about how, Black people can expect a race war, and by golly, they're not going to win it. How this American South was created as white man's land, quote unquote. That's literally what their leader, Michael Hill, said, and so on. So, we see, and the League of the South has been the premier organization in the United States pushing false ideas about the Civil War. Ideas, some of which we've mentioned, but there are a whole slew of them. Like, for instance, the absolutely bogus claim that thousands and thousands and thousands of Black slaves at the time of the Civil War fought happily and voluntarily to preserve slavery in the South, fought on the side of the Confederacy.
Yeah, because it was so great for them.
Yeah. I guess
According to Wilson, it was.
How absurdly false that is. But it's these kinds of ideas. And, I live in Montgomery, Alabama, and there are an awful lot of people down here who believe some of these ideas. The Black Confederate myth is a very widely believed myth. Certainly, I'm sure that there are literally tens of millions of Americans who believe that the Civil War was unrelated to slavery, that was an ex post facto slur created by Northern historians, and, all that kind of idea. And, just to state the obvious, anyone who's studied history, any real historian, knows these things are absolutely false. And it's been shown the Civil War was about slavery, period. There's really no dispute about it. It can be shown in any number of ways, and we can talk about that if that's relevant. But in any case, the original question you asked was, how far are these ideas spreading out into society? How dangerous are they? I think very dangerous. And I think, the idea that we have 72 or 73 million Americans that believe that Donald Trump is a great guy and that he won the election and so on shows how far, at least this kind, if not specifically this slab of ignorance, this kind of ignorance has spread through society and made it difficult for people to think clearly.
There's another couple aspects to what you just said too. For example, his homeschooling organization, someone told me on Twitter the other day, and I went and looked at this, that his homeschooling organization, it appears to be fairly mainstream. So for example, let's say you're a Christian family out of any town, USA, and you want to homeschool your kids and you're looking for curriculum and Christian curriculum. You're going to go with a couple places, maybe Bob Jones University Press or some of these other ones. And then you come across this thing. You don't know anything about Doug Wilson, but it's a whole curriculum of your Christian school stuff. So that's gone more mainstream, isn't it? So you have potentially Christian homeschool families who are using his stuff, his curriculum. And then the other thing too, David Barton, I'm sure you're familiar with him, Wall Builders. I read an article on his site, which rang very similar to what Wilson and his
Stephen Wilkins.
Yeah, what Wilson and Wilkins wrote in their Southern Slavery book. This article on the Wall Builders website was almost the same kind of thing. It was an apology for, or apologetic, I should say, for, it wasn't so bad. Slaves didn't have it so bad, and the Bible actually condoned slavery. So I don't really see what the problem was.
And it's remarkable how close these ideas are to the ideas of the Ku Klux Klan. Right.
Exactly.
And that it's just said a little differently. For the Klan, it's like, well, what did slavery do? Well, it rescued these barbaric people from their sort of cannibalistic tribes in Africa. And plus, cool little footnote, they were Christianized to boot. So look
it's
how
much
win-win. They should be. And so that's literally what you'll hear from the Klan today. It's like Black Americans should get down on their knees and thank white people for enslaving them because, they're so much better off than other Black people are, all around the world.
In your view now, looking at this issue of, like, for example, Black Lives Matter and how that's been vilified, Antifa, Black Lives Matter by Trump and the right, does that thinking play into some of that? Because it's a vilification, not just of a movement, but obviously it has something to do with race as well. Clearly, it must do. Do you see a connection in what you just articulated there?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that Christian Reconstructionists, Doug Wilson, even Wilkins, have tried to push away, the open white supremacy, at least to make it less visible. But, it's their embrace of Dabney is, to me, what shows, how clearly they really are fundamentally racist. I looked at the New St. Andrews College website a couple of days ago. There is no one on it who's not white. And there are enormous numbers of people there, about 1 billion, associate pastors and this person and that person, boards of directors. They're universally white. That school also, by the way, and this I know from local reports up there and what residents who've been part of the church and left or part of New St. Andrews College and left, the college is hung with pictures of Confederate generals.
Right. I was going to say that.
They celebrate the birthday of Robert E. Lee. Right. So
in
it's
Idaho?
what Wilson and Wilkins have really done is they have taken this kind of Christian nationalism, which is a weak name for Christian Reconstruction. But in any case, this idea of Christians ought to run the world politically or run the country politically, and married it to these ideas about the Confederacy and what the Civil War was all about and so on. And probably even more important than Doug Wilson has been his pal of many years, Steve Wilkins. Wilkins's church in Monroe, Louisiana, actually has an adjoining, an attached institute for the study of Robert L. Dabney. So, and, I at one point read a really remarkable thing. Steve Wilkins created a curriculum for American high school students, the teaching of American history. And it is a wild tale, which ends, by the way, for Wilkins in 1865. That's it. He doesn't tell you a thing more because after that, it all went to hell, obviously.
After they lost
and it is a very bizarre take on American history, which has nothing to do with what actually happened in the United States. But in any case, there's been a confluence of these ideas of kind of extreme Christian nationalism with these views. I mean, we start talking about race, these views that are clearly racial when we talk about neo-Confederate ideology. And these
You're absolutely right. You have to know where these connections are, because I was looking on the ATI website, which is the Bill Gothard cult, and they have this huge arm, again, of homeschooling. the Advanced Training Institute, and I was scrolling through some of the resources and what they offer parents, again, as homeschooling curriculum resource. And there was 2 books that jumped out right away. I saw a couple of books by R.J. Rushdoony, and I thought, whoa, why are they pushing R.J. Rushdoony, American history? So there's an interesting connection. And they had some books by Dabney. And I'm like, okay, I know who Dabney is because I read the articles about the theological war thesis, and I knew Rushdoony's connection, which you've been articulating here. Why are these guys appearing on Bill Gothard's homeschooling curriculum website resource list? So it all comes around full circle, doesn't it? So shows the pervasive influence of this kind of thinking in Christian homeschooling.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I also think you're right when you say that, there are undoubtedly very large numbers of parents who see themselves as Christians, who aren't white supremacists, who don't have particularly bizarre ideas about American history or Christianity or religion in general, but who nevertheless wind up with these materials, in their homes and then teach them to their kids. And, and there's a lot of overlap, and we've already discussed this, but, sure. The idea of headship is much more widely spread in the evangelical world than Christian Reconstruction, and there's a similarity. There's really a straight up overlap.
It is. Yeah, it is. Well, this is really interesting. I'm glad that you're able to spend some time talking to us, informing us about, Doug Wilson for sure, but looking at all these other connections. So thank you so much for your time. Before we go, how can people find you? How can people get a hold of you? What's the best way on social media?
I have a website. It's Mark Potok, MarkPotok.net, N-E-T. And that's the best way. There's a contact form. I don't generally give out my email, to the broad public simply because, I've had so many threats from Klan groups and neo-Nazi groups and so on that I'd rather not open myself up to a lot of that. But in any case, I'm easy to reach. I also have a Facebook page. I'm on LinkedIn, so I'm easy to find. But there is a contact form that will come right to me via my own website.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. Once again, apologies for any discrepancies we had trying to get this together, but we got it done in the end. So thank you so much. And I will speak to you again.
Okay. A real pleasure. And let's do it again.